Today, senators started the day with general speeches, and in about half an hour, 5 o'clock Eastern Time, they're going to return to debate a bill to fund the Army Corps of Engineers water projects. Senators are considering amendments. No votes today. A vote is scheduled for tomorrow to limit debate and amendments to the bill. And one amendment proposed by Louisiana Democrat Mary Landrieu would freeze flood insurance rates for a number of years. Earlier on the floor, Senator Sessions, we were watching some of the Judiciary Committee from last week. They had begun consideration of the 300 amendments to the immigration bill. The first set of those amendments dealt with technical corrections and improvements to the bill, and we'll rejoin that now.
People here in unlawful status are going to get a green card. It's naive to ignore the fact that these people are already here. I think most Americans recognize that right now. To say that this is adding to the number of immigrants is simply not really a logical response. It's an emotional response, because every year illegal immigrants come into the country in addition to the ones who are here. So unless the goal is to deport the 11 million, which I don't believe you're suggesting that, isn't it better to have the people who are already here subject to labor laws so they can't be exploited at the expense of U.S. workers, registered with the government, doing what they're supposed to do, pay taxes and all of those other things? That's the premise of our bill. And it is true that our bill reduces the family and employment green card backlogs. But again, those people are already coming, even if we do nothing. So in the future, our bill reforms our legal immigration system, making it more geared towards work, high-skilled immigrants, which I know is something that you have told me you support. Last year, 70% of our immigrants were family-based, 14% of our immigrants were employment-based. Our bill changes that around rather significantly. Under our bill, we get closer to 50-50. We do this by eliminating the category of sibling immigration, the diversity visa, although we do make room for families that are already waiting to be united more quickly. And we move to a merit-based system. So it is not that, oh, this bill is allowing many more people to come into this country than would have come. They're coming. They're either coming under law or not under law. And what we do is try to rationalize that system. But I would argue to you that this argument that there are going to be 20 million new people in this country under this bill ignores the fact that there are going to be lots of millions under this in the country illegally if we don't have a bill.
Well, it is hard, Senator Schumer, to calculate, and by eliminating this so-called backlog, which basically is the caps that are placed on the number of family-based, chain migration-based people who can come in, those will be moved forward, and the caps on some of the new flows will be removed entirely. And having those moved out, you have a new flow of people that come in under that. So you will see an increase in numbers through that. It's about 4.5 million as I calculate. Los Angeles Times has found that under the new legal entry into the country, you've got about a 50% increase in that.
Well,
so which would be about 15 million on a regular basis, but it could be more. That's sort of a mid-level estimate of what the numbers are. So you got 11 plus 5, that's 15, plus another 15 is about 30 million people, is it not, given legal status in the next 10 years? And shouldn't we be concerned about the future flow if we're going to have such a large number of people being advanced in their
I would just say there's some simple math here. You're adding 11 million, they're already here.
Well, they're going to be given full legal status to compete for jobs.
He's trying to answer your question, Senator. Let him do that.
By the way, they're competing for jobs right now. I ride my bicycle around Brooklyn early in the morning. I see people gathered on street corners, okay? Some guy in a truck comes over and says, I'll pay you $10 if you work all day. They're competing with Americans who wouldn't accept $10 a day to work in those jobs. So they are competing right now, and I would argue that they lower the wage scale much more than if they were registered and working in a legal way. Number two, but they're here. So take away those 11 million. We do allow family unification. It's the humane and right thing to do. But many of those people would be allowed to be unified under present laws. Some is sped up, but not that much. But third, I would say to my colleague, you don't know if the economy goes very well here and the economy goes badly in Mexico and we do nothing, the number of illegal immigrants will increase and could be far beyond what this bill is. So again, my main point here is this. The system is broken. The American people have given us a mandate to fix it. We fix it in a rational way. And to simply point to who we allow to work here and who we allow to come here does not take into account who would be coming here and to be allowed to work here if we continued to do nothing, which I think just about everyone of each political stripe has said is unacceptable. So what I'd await is your comprehensive immigration bill and how you would deal with the 11 million people who are here, with the people whose families are torn apart. What is your solution? I know you're critical of our bill, and I respect that, and I know it comes from the heart. But the status quo will also continue to drive the numbers up, and I would argue in a way that is less friendly to the American economy and less friendly to what is the right thing to do for our families than present law.
Well, Senator Schumer, you're most articulate and able, and you know I respect you greatly.
It's mutual.
But look, it is not going to be helpful for American workers when these 11 million are legalized. They'll then be able to take virtually any job in the marketplace. Many now are, because they're illegal and didn't come here lawfully, are not able to take the best jobs. But then they'll be able to compete for those. And we've got millions of Americans unemployed. We've got a huge, incredible number of people dropping out of the workforce. Wages have not kept up with inflation. And I believe you've got not only a situation in your bill that legalizes immediately a large number, maybe 15 million, but your annual flow increases. And so this adds even more to the country. And polls show the American people believe in immigration, but they think, if anything, the numbers ought to be reduced, not increased, not increased on top of the amnesty that will be in this bill. I'm really worried about workers. I think we need to talk about that a lot. That's why I thought a more discrete package of legislative proposals separately, more like the House is doing, a step-by-step proposal, would be better. Do you dispute the fact that we'd probably legalize over 30 million in the next 10 years?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a friendly question of Senator Schumer?
Of course. And then I said normally something like this would just be done routinely, and I realize people want to talk about it. So why don't you do that, and maybe we should just call the roll on the amendment. But go ahead.
Senator Schumer referred to the bill's increase in Border Patrol agents, and presumably this is a reference to Section 1102, which, in fact, our reading is that it just increases customs officers, not Border Patrol agents, and we'd like to get a clarification
Yes.
on this point.
It's not Border Patrol. Sorry. Excuse me. It is not Border Patrol. They're already at 21,000. Their numbers have gone way, way up, and most people think they're an adequate number. We need technology and other things, fence and other things to do this. This is the customs officers who have to process the people.
Well, we need both.
Well,
we'll
the amendment,
talk about that.
the bill allows both, because we do not specify out of the $3 billion what it should be used for. We, on the good advice of some of my colleagues who share southwestern borders, as you do, they felt it would be better to leave it up to the experts as to which would greatly stop the flow. In some places you may need more agents, in other places you don't.
Thank you for the clarification.
Okay.
Okay. If there's nothing else, we can just go ahead and call the roll on the amendment. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Feinstein.
Aye.
Mr. Schumer.
Aye.
Mr. Durbin. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Franken.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Coons.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Blumenthal.
Aye.
Ms. Hirono. Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Hatch.
By the way, if a million people came in,
No.
Mr. Grant.
more than 30 million.
Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Lee.
This is good.
Mr. Cruz.
I'm just saying.
Mr. Flake. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the votes are 14 yeas, 4 nays.
14 yeas, 4 nays, and the amendment to the amendment is agreed to. I have a
That does bode well.
list of 11 amendments in order today that I hope we can adopt in block. Let me just take a moment to explain them. The first is my amendment to prohibit border crossing fees.
Right.
It has broad bipartisan support. I thank
Hatch.
Senator Cornyn for supporting my effort to prevent the imposition of such a financial burden on our border communities. Senator Graham talked about the Canadians who come down to Myrtle Beach. As most members know, my parents-in-law were French Canadians and came to Vermont as immigrants. My wife was born in Vermont, learned to speak English when she was 4 or 5 years old. But I know on the northern border, we go back and forth all the time. Families visiting families, relatives visiting relatives. It is a major part of our economy in our state of Vermont. I suspect in most northern border states, an imposition of a fee, a toll, to go back and forth makes no sense. By the same token, the southern border, it's the same thing. So the First Amendment is the one that Senator Cornyn and I worked on, the border crossing fee. The second one is one I worked on with Senator Grassley, reporting to Grassley 2, reporting to Senate and House Judiciary. The third one is the Grassley 5, the audits of Border Trust Fund. The next one is Senator Sessions 36, expanding the functions of DHS Ombudsman. The next one is the Cornyn 6, additional reporting requirements to FBI. The next one is Flake 1, the Private Landowners to Border Oversight Commission. The next is Flake 2, the alternate reporting schedule for DHS status report. The next is Feinstein 6, standards for children in immigration custody. The next, Feinstein 7, grant program Operation Stone Garden. The next is Feinstein 8, maritime assets for DHS to bill. The next is Rono 24, clarifying the role of the DHS amendment. So there are 5 Democratic, 6 Republican amendments. I want to move them. They're now pending, and they've been called up. I'd like to vote them on block unless...
Could you give us the numbers?
I just did.
There's probably people that want to speak on these.
Of course.
I would have
I yield to Senator Grassley.
well, first of all, for your...
Just a moment. Senator Feinstein asked again for the numbers. Leahy 1, Grassley 2, Grassley 5, Section 36, Cornyn 6, Flake 1, Flake 2, Feinstein 6, Feinstein 7, Feinstein 8, and Hirono 24.
I have a question on your amendment.
Yeah.
Because as I understand it, it would prevent the federal government from collecting any border crossing fees for pedestrians or passenger vehicles. Are fees such as this needed for us to establish an effective entry-exit system so that we know who's entering the country and whether they actually depart? And the second question I would ask you, does it apply to passenger vehicles that are used in commerce?
No, my feeling is we're spending enough on fees and taxes already as Americans to protect our border. This is basically a toll going across the border. It tells our customs agents, our border people, well, you're going to become toll collectors instead of law enforcement. Anybody who lives in a border state, north or south, knows the number of communities that are connected.
Mr. President, Friday's Washington Post reported that Secretary Sebelius of the Department of Health and Human Services has, quote, gone hat in hand to health industry executives, asking them to make large financial donations to help with the effort to implement President Obama's landmark health care law." End of quote. I ask consent to include in the record the Washington Post article following my remarks.
Without objection.
The article further said that the, quote, "unusual fundraising push comes after Congress has repeatedly rejected the administration's request for additional funds to set up the Affordable Health Care Act." The article said many of the Secretary's calls have recruited support for Enroll America, described as the most prominent nonprofit working on the health care law's implementation. Its president, Ann Philippic, the article goes on to say, joined the group in January after service as White House Deputy Director for Public Engagement. Today, the New York Times included an article by Robert Peer, "Cabinet Secretary solicits large donations to publicize health care law." I ask consent to include the article following my remarks.
Without objection.
In the article, it said Mrs. Sebelius has made calls soliciting support from the health care industry, including insurance and pharmaceutical executives. A spokesman for Ms. Sebelius says she suggested that health care executives and others support the work of Enroll America, a private nonprofit group that shares the President's goal of securing coverage for people without insurance. The insurance executive said that some insurers have been asked for $1 million in donations. An insurance executive said that. And the bigger companies, the article says, have been asked for a lot more. Administration's officials said private donations were needed because Congress had provided much less money than Mr. Obama requested to publicize the new law and get people enrolled in health care plans subsidized by the government. The article further talks about Ms. Philippic. She worked on Mr. Obama's 2008 campaign. She was Deputy Director of the Democratic National Committee. She worked in the Obama White House as a Deputy for Public Engagement. She said her time is not political in her work for Enroll America. She says, "We're thrilled to be working with the Secretary Sebelius and to have her support." Several executives who received these calls for money said they were uncomfortable with the discussions because the federal government has the power to approve or reject the health plans they want to sell in insurance market that will be run by federal officials in 30 states. Mr. Secretary, Secretary Sebelius is fundraising for and coordinating with private entities helping to implement the new health care law may be illegal, should cease immediately, and should be fully investigated by Congress. Later this week, I'll be sending a letter with several of my colleagues to the Government Accountability Office asking them to examine the issue. We'll be asking the GAO to examine the amount of coordination between the Department of Health and Human Services and Enroll America, and whether Secretary Sebelius is trying to do through a private entity activities that Congress has refused to allow the department to do. Such private fundraising, as these articles describe, circumvents the constitutional requirement that only Congress may appropriate funds. If the Secretary and others in her department are closely coordinating with the activities of Enroll America, which is headed by the former White House aide, then those actions may be in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. The limits of the Anti-Deficiency Act were fully explored by Congress during the Iran-Contra incident when Reagan administration official Oliver North raised funds and directed their spending through private entities in support of Nicaraguan rebels, even though Congress had refused to appropriate such funds. This produced a select joint committee of the Congress, including many of its most distinguished members, the Iran-Contra Joint Select Committee. The Senate ranking members were Senator Inouye and Senator Warren Rudman of New Hampshire. The House leaders were Lee Hamilton and Dick Cheney, who was the ranking Republican. The report of the Select Iran Committee, Senate Report Number 100-216 at page 413 said, quote, "The constitutional plan," referring to the United States Constitution, "does not prohibit the President from urging other countries to give money directly to the Contras, the rebel group in Nicaragua. But the Constitution does prohibit receipt and collection of such funds by this government absent an appropriation. This prohibition may not be evaded by use of a nominally private entity if the entity is in reality an arm of the government and the government is able to direct how the money is spent. The report also said, quote, Congress' exclusive control over the expenditure of funds cannot legally be evaded through the use of gifts or donations to the executive branch. Were it otherwise, a president whose appropriation requests were rejected by Congress could raise money through private sources or from other countries for armies, military actions, armed systems, or even domestic programs. Let me read this again. This is the Joint Committee, Senator Inouye, Senator Rudman, members of the House, bipartisan. Were it otherwise, a president whose appropriations requests were rejected by Congress could raise money through private sources or from other countries for armies, military actions, armed systems, or even domestic programs. That's page 412, page 413 of the Joint Iran-Contra Select Committee report. Friday's Washington Post reported that the Secretary's spokesman said that Sebelius is working with private entities on, quote, our mission, unquote, of implementing health care law activities, although Congress has refused to appropriate more funds. If the Department of Human Services closely coordinates with Enroll America and with other such entities, then the analogy with Iran-Contra is strong. It's hard for me to see, Mr. President, the difference. There's a difference in where Oliver North got his money in 1985, 6, and 7 with Iran-Contra. It was some of it came from the hostages for arms sale. But the question is not as much where the money comes from, although in this case the Secretary may be raising it from people she regulates, which could also be illegal. The question is where the money is going. And in the case of Iran-Contra, the money was going to a private entity supporting a rebel army in Nicaragua in contravention of the Boland Amendment passed by Congress. In other words, Congress had said no, and the administration did it anyway. And that's precisely, it seems to me, what's happening here. Congress has said no, we're not going to appropriate any more money or as much as you want to implement the health care law, and the Secretary appears to be raising money from people she regulates to give it to private entities with whom she coordinates to do what Congress has refused to do. Now, Mr. President, the problem with that first is the Constitution of the United States, which gives the power of the purse to the United States Congress, Article 1. Number 2, there is a federal law that says that you can't do through private entities what Congress has refused to do. That's called the anti-deficiency law. And 3, there's some federal laws about raising money from people you regulate for whatever purpose. The Secretary may activities may violate those federal laws prohibiting raising private funds from those she regulates. Federal law permits a narrow band of private fundraising activities, but this has always been interpreted very narrowly. And this would not be the first violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act by the Secretary's HHS. The General Accountability Office found HHS in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act 3 times last year. I'm most concerned, Mr. President, that the Secretary's actions reflect a deep disregard running throughout the administration for the constitutional role of the elected representatives in the legislative branch. We saw it in the President's decision in January of 2012 to bypass the Senate's role of advice and consent and make appointments, recess appointments, which are authorized by the Constitution at a time when the Senate said it wasn't in recess. A federal court quickly ruled these appointments were unconstitutional because the Senate was not in recess. But the individuals continue to show up at the National Labor Relations Board and pretend they have the authority to issue decisions. We see this in the number of executive orders that the President has used to circumvent Congress. on issues as important as immigration enforcement, and in the number of czars whose responsibilities are intended for roles that need the Senate's advice and consent. We see it in the Department of Education, where the Secretary is turning a simple waiver authority in No Child Left Behind into a conditional waiver, with the Secretary using his authority to make decisions that should be made by Congress or should be made locally by state and local governments. The HHS Secretary's actions may follow an administration pattern, but in this case it's in a pattern that appears it may be illegal and it demands investigation. So I will be, as I said, with other members of Congress later this week, sending a letter to the Government Accountability Office asking them to look at these facts. Mr. President, I would like to read a few paragraphs from the Iran-Contra report that was issued by the Joint Select Committee, Democrats and Republicans, in the late 1980s. The Constitution contemplates that the government will conduct its affairs only with funds appropriated by Congress. By resorting to funds not appropriated by Congress, indeed funds denied the executive branch by Congress, administration officials committed a transgression far more basic than a violation of the Boland Amendment. That was the amendment that said you can't use federal dollars to support rebels in Nicaragua. The power of the purse, continued the Joint Select Committee. This was a bipartisan report, but it was written at a time when we had a Democratic Congress. The power of the purse, which the framers vested in Congress, has long been recognized as the most important simple curb in the Constitution on presidential power. The framers were determined not to combine the power of the purse and the power of the sword in the same branch of government. The constitutional process that lodges control of government expenditures exclusively in Congress is the Anti-Deficiency Act, which prohibits an officer of the United States from authorizing an expenditure that has not been the subject of a congressional appropriation or that exceeds the amount of any applicable appropriation. Thus, the Anti-Deficiency Act provides an officer or employee of the United States government may not make or authorize an expenditure or obligation exceeding an amount available in an appropriation or fund for the appropriate expenditure or obligation, or involve the government in a contract or obligation for the payment of money before an appropriation is made unless authorized by law. Mr. President, I ask consent to include, following my remarks, these excerpts from the Joint Committee's report. Article 1, Section 8, Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution, which says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of an appropriation made by law. And then two other things. One is the purported authority that the Secretary's spokesman is citing for her actions in raising money. I haven't seen the authority for raising money from people she regulates, but 42 U.S.C. Section 300U1A talks about grants and contracts for research programs and says the Secretary is authorized to conduct and support by grant or contract, parentheses, and encourage others to support, close parentheses, research in health information and health promotion, preventive health services, and education in the appropriate use of health care. Applications for grants and contracts under this section shall be subject to appropriate peer review. Mr. President, this small section relates to support for contracts for research of information programs in the form of grants or contracts. The parenthetical language, encourage others to support, has to be read as encouraging others to support such programs. It is far-fetched to say that it gives the Secretary authority to encourage third parties to give money to nonprofits providing Obamacare information that the Department of Health and Human Services cannot fund directly because Congress has refused to appropriate. This small section and the words in parentheses cannot amend the Constitution of the United States and invalidate Article 1. This section cannot supersede the Anti-Deficiency Act, according to the language of the Bipartisan Joint Committee. There is obviously a way, Mr. President, to have appropriate public-private contracts. We have them all throughout government, public-private associations to try to improve our country. We do that with HIV/AIDS. We do it with a whole variety of things. When I was Education Secretary, I worked with the first President Bush to set up the New American Schools Development Corporation, which encouraged a private corporation headed by a former New Jersey Governor Tom Kean, which would raise money to create models for private schools. And then later on, President Bush, the first, asked Congress to do some things in support of those schools. And all of us encouraged that. But that was quite different. That was an effort that would be typical of many public-private partnerships that the federal government is involved in, where in this case we said we want to encourage the support of model schools. Here is a private corporation that's doing that. We encourage that. Congress wasn't objecting to that. Congress hadn't said you can't do that. Congress hadn't been asked to vote on an appropriation for the New American Schools Development Corporation, and Congress had not said you can't do that. So that would be true with dozens, maybe hundreds of public-private partnerships between the federal government and private organizations for the same goal. But what we're talking about, Mr. President, and why the analogy between what Secretary Sebelius is doing and what Oliver North was doing in the Reagan administration in the late 1980s is so strong, is that in each case, the money seems to be raised privately and spent through private entities for a function that Congress has refused to appropriate money for. It's not so much where the money came from, it's more where the money's going. And the Constitution itself, in Article I, makes it absolutely clear that no one can appropriate dollars for a federal program other than the United States Congress. And a subterfuge that goes around that, seeks to go around that by raising private money, putting it in private entities for the same purpose that Congress has either refused to appropriate money for or said that you can't do, that is outside the Constitution. It's not allowed by the Constitution of the United States, and it's against the Anti-Deficiency Act. And then there's a separate question of whether it's appropriate to raise money from people that the Secretary regulates. So, Mr. President, I'm deeply concerned about this. I hope the Secretary will stop this action. I hope the public-private partnerships that we have throughout government will continue where they're appropriate. But we need for the executive branch of government to show proper respect to the people of this country who elect their members of Congress. We are Article I, they are Article II. The purpose of the power of appropriation is to put a curb on the executive branch. And if the Congress says no, then the executive cannot spend money, nor can the executive go through a subterfuge of private organizations and private fundraising in support of the very same objective that Congress has refused to approve. In this case, the Secretary seems to say that the reason they're doing that is because Congress has refused to appropriate more money to implement the health care law. That seems to me to be just admitting a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, admitting a violation of the proper division of responsibilities in the Constitution. Yes, the Congress has refused to do that, but that's the Congress privilege to do that, and when the Congress does that, the administration may not proceed to spend the money that the Congress hasn't authorized, whether directly through the government or indirectly through private entities. So later this week, we'll be asking the General Accountability Office, the Government Accountability Office, to look into these facts. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about it. And I would hope that in the meantime, the Secretary will stop making the phone calls, stop coordinating with private entities to do things that Congress has specifically refused to do. I thank the President. I yield the floor. Oh, Mr. President, may I vitiate the quorum? I ask to add to the list of articles at the end of my remarks a article published July 9, 1991, Bush sets up foundation to start model schools as an example of an appropriate way to have a public-private partnership or a private enterprise that is encouraged by the government, but not in a way that seeks to do something that the Congress has refused to do.
Without objection.
I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President,
Senator from Tennessee.
I ask to vitiate the quorum, and I ask consent to also include in the record the names
Without
of
objection.
The names of the members of the Iran-Contra Select Committee.
Without objection.
I yield the floor and notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And in a quorum call here on the floor of the Senate, they started the day with general speeches and are planning on debating the Army Corps of Engineers Water Projects bill. Senators considering amendments. No votes today, though a vote is scheduled for tomorrow to limit debate and amendments to the bill. Also tomorrow, 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time, the markup of the immigration legislation, pending legislation and vote on those nominations, 10 o'clock a.m. until noon. Over on our companion network, C-SPAN, and then our coverage of the immigration markup will change to C-SPAN 3 from noon until it's finished. And we'll have more immigration markup on Thursday as well on the C-SPAN networks. While we are in this quorum call, we're going to take a look back at last week's action in the Senate Judiciary Committee when they had begun consideration of the 300 amendments to the immigration bill. This is a continuation of the first set that they looked at that dealt with the technical corrections and improvements to the bill, and we rejoin that hearing now.
Amendment, but I want to say that it ought to not be controversial based upon the polling that's been done, saying that the massive amount of people want an immigration bill passed, because that polling has always had associated with it border security, the condition that the border be secure almost as a basis for doing anything. And also, I'd like to see my amendment as a truth in packaging amendment, because I think that that has been the basis of most everything that the Group of 8 has said about their legislation, that the border has to be secure. And so the point of my amendment is that there's going to be a massive amount of change in our immigration policy even before the border's secure. And so my prepared remarks follow up on that main point. This amendment would require the Secretary to certify to Congress that the Secretary has maintained effective control over the entire southern border for 6 months before processing applications for RPI status. To summarize, the bill requires the Secretary of Homeland Security within 6 months that a bill is signed into law to submit a comprehensive southern border strategy. That'd be number one. And secondly, a southern border fencing strategy. After those plans are submitted to Congress, the Secretary shall start processing applications to legalize the 12 million people that are presently in the United States. The result is that undocumented population become legal after a mere plan is submitted, despite the potential that the plan could be flawed or inadequate. So, what if the plan does not work? The bill is, as a result, legalization first, enforcement later, just opposite to what the people think that they're getting, and I think just opposite what a lot of members of the Congress think that is in this bill laid before us. RPI is more than probation, it is legalization. Once a person gets RPI, they get the freedom to live and work here. They get to work authorization, driver's license, opportunity to move up, all this before the border is truly secure. The sponsors tell us that people will wait 10 to 13 years. They say it'll be tough and an expensive road. They even say that it would be easier to just go home than to go through the process. I disagree. RPI status is de facto permanent legalization, never to be taken away. Given the history of these types of programs, it won't end. And that brings me back, not to elaborate on it as I have in the past, but to mistakes that were made in 1986, and I voted for what turned out to be mistakes, and we screwed up, and we shouldn't do it again. No supporter of the bill has said that RPI status would be taken away. The triggers are meaningless, and millions of people will be legalized in the first few months after we pass this. And the Secretary has the authority to renew the program, which I think is obvious would happen. My amendment improves the trigger and fulfills the wish of the American people. My amendment ensures that the border is secured before one person gets legal status under the Act. It requires the entire border, not just high-risk areas, to be controlled. It says the Secretary's security and fencing strategies, as called for in the underlying bill, would have to be fully implemented before green cards are distributed. If we pass the bill as is, there will be no pressure on this administration or future administrations to secure the border. There will be no push by legalization advocates to get that job done. So if the people of this country want to make sure the border is secure first, before any other movements are taken, it seems to me that one of the forces that best can make this happen is if all the advocates for legalization, as well as all the people in the administration, as well as all the people here on this committee and in the Congress that know our immigration system is broken and it needs to be fixed, we all are in the same boat together to make sure that the border is secure. So we need to work together to accomplish that goal. The American people, as we know, are compassionate, or we wouldn't have 1 million people coming here every year under our legal program. Many can come to terms with a legalization program, but many would say that the legalization program should be tied to border security and enforcement. The inference has been left. Almost every poll shows the same results. Sure, people would consider a legalization program, but it's almost always tied to a condition of border security. Unfortunately, too many people have been led to believe that the bill will force DHS Secretary to secure the border. First, the bill only applies to the southern border. Second, the bill only says the high-risk sectors have been deemed effectively controlled. The bill defines effective control as the ability to achieve and maintain persistent surveillance and an effective rate of 90% or higher. Some people would think, and I'm not here to say this right now, but we should enforce existing law, and that would be 100% operational control. Under the Secure Fence Act of 2006, Congress told DHS that the border should be 100% operationally controlled. This was also the metric that the Senate used as a trigger when we last considered legislation that obviously didn't get passed, the 2007 immigration bill. Under current law, operational control means the prevention of all unlawful entries into the United States, including entries by terrorists, other unlawful aliens, instruments of terrorism, narcotics, and other contraband. We all know that this administration abandoned that metric and just decided not to follow the statute. This bill before us weakens current law by only requiring the southern border to be 90% effectively secured in some sectors, only the so-called high-risk sectors. And my amendment doesn't deal with that 90%. That stays the way it is in the bill. But let me explain why border security is so important. According to the Congressional Research Service, there are a variety of threats to our border. There are potential terrorists and transnational criminals. Foreign nationals use the porous border to import threatening goods such as weapons of mass destruction, illegal drugs, contraband, counterfeit products, and other products meant to do Americans harm. Not everyone that crosses the southern border happens to be a resident of our neighbor to the south, Mexico, that just wishes to find a job and earn money to send back home. We categorize people crossing the border from Mexico other than Americans, and they're crossing, other than Mexicans, I should say, are crossing the border every day. The last figure I saw from 2010 showed that nearly 60,000, quote-unquote, other than Mexicans crossed the border that year. Thousands are coming each month. Not securing our border is a national security issue that cannot be ignored. So allow me to explain the amendment. Under my amendment, the Secretary would have to prove that we have, quote-unquote, effective control as defined in this bill. I don't change that definition. For 6 months before application for registered provisional immigrant status is processed. This means that the border will be secured before one person gets legal status, which in turn entitles that person to work authorization, travel permits, and the ability to live in the United States, and make sure that everybody in the United States that wants immigration reform is in the same boat trying to push for it. I realize that one or more sponsors of the bill may be concerned that border security section is weak. One member of the group of 8 has already said that the bill will have trouble passing the House and will struggle passing this Senate unless the border security title is fixed. This person admitted that there's work to do on this issue. My amendment is a step in that direction. People don't seem to trust the government will get it right, or that this administration is dedicated to security. We don't need a new bill to do that. We need to prove it to them, and this amendment will prove it to them. I yield the floor and thank all my colleagues for the long period of time I've taken to explain my amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I very much appreciate what the ranking member is trying to do. I'm not really sure it's necessary, and let me tell you why. The Security Act requires 700 miles of border fence. It's my understanding we've built 651 of those miles. That would leave 49 miles left to go. We have more than doubled the Border Patrol. I mean, I think it's in excess of 20 to 25,000 people on the border. There are drones, there are cameras, there are overhead manned vehicles, and border intrusions are substantially down. So if you do this, the impact of it is to have people, you know, differing over where to go next, or and to delay the triggering of the application process. Candidly, Senator, I am amazed at the progress that's being made. I mean, just the California border alone, it's amazing to see how it's been toughened, and that extends all along the way. And I think the beauty of what's happened is not necessarily that it all relies on fence. It relies on backup, automated facilities, cameras, aerial surveillance. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to have a perfect situation as long as people can tunnel underground and swim rivers. But I just hate to see the bill delayed when all this progress has been made already.
Could I react?
Sure.
First of all, I don't question the chairman's the senator from California's sincerity. And I hope what she says is accurate, but it seems to me that your argument makes it all the more easy just to have the bill say so.
Senator Flake?
Mr. Chairman. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I really appreciate a lot of these amendments put forward, and I know the ranking minority member just wants to make this better and wants to make the border more secure. And believe me, coming from Arizona, that's what we want as well. But we not only suffer from people crossing the border, we suffer from having a big population of people who are here illegally now. And we don't know what status they are. We don't know where they are. They're in the shadows, and we've got to bring them out. And so I think it would not be a good move to wait on that process. We've got to know who's here. And in order to implement the other parts of the bill, the second border, if you will, is workplace enforcement. The faster we can get those out of the shadows and then start that process, which the ranking minority member has been very strong on over the years, of getting mandatory E-Verify in this process, and it is. But to do that effectively, you've got to bring people out of the shadows, and to delay that process, I think, would not be the right approach. So like I said, I know that the ranking minority member simply wants to make the border more secure. So do we. Believe me, in Arizona, we feel it. And but I think it would be the wrong approach to delay bringing people out of the shadows. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, and go ahead, Senator Corey.
Mr. Chairman, I acknowledge the good faith of everyone in trying to achieve the goal of knowing who's coming into the country and why they're here. And I agree with the ranking member, Senator Grassley, that this is really a confidence-building measure, border security. And if it doesn't work as advertised, then we will have failed in our responsibility. We will not have solved the problem. And so I know we have California's border, I believe, is probably different than Texas. Arizona's is different than Texas. We have the longest stretch of common border with Mexico, and of 1,200 miles. And to Senator Grassley's point, I was in Brooks County, Texas on Sunday and Monday. On Sunday alone in the Rio Grande Valley sector, they detained 700 people coming across the border illegally. 400 of those 700 were from Central America. And so Mexico has not been a good partner. in terms of preventing illegal immigration into Mexico. Mexico's economy is doing better, but honestly, Central America's economy is a disaster, and they've got a lot of law enforcement problems, so there are a lot of people fleeing that situation. But the problem is that we've got to get this right, and the Department of, to Senator Flake's point, in 1996, we passed a law that said you have to have an entry-exit system, and that still hasn't been implemented. We've made promises before in legislation which never seems to come to pass. And so that's why I believe in the importance of the triggers in this bill. And I think what Senator Grassley proposes is a common-sense additional trigger. Let me just make another point. In the GAO in 2011, in reviewing the Department of Homeland Security's border security efforts, said that less than 45% of the southern border was under operational control. That's in 2011. And DHS, in response, suspended that metric and said they were going to come up with an index and eliminate this concept of operational control. I think the gang's proposal in that respect is actually an improvement, certainly over what the Department of Homeland Security has done. I think we can all agree that the number of detentions or apprehensions at the border tells us virtually nothing about the people who got away. In fact, anecdotally, the Border Patrol on Sunday and Monday were telling me they think they maybe catch 1 out of every 4 people coming across the border, maybe 1 out of every 3. That's a problem because 360,000 people were detained at our southern border last year. So if you figure they got 1 out of 3 or maybe 1 out of 4, that just gives you an idea of the scope of the problem, generally speaking. So I think the only way we're going to be able to credibly make the Department of Homeland Security do what this bill says we want, which is to secure the border, is to provide triggers like the one that Senator Grassley suggested, but also, again, I commend the Gang of 8 for what you've done in the bill, generally speaking, but I just want to make clear that there is no border security trigger currently in the bill, and what Senator Grassley's proposal would impose an effective trigger that I think would incentivize everyone to do what we all know needs to be done and we want done, which is to provide operational control of the border.
Thank you, Senator Schumer.
Thank you, and I appreciate both the comments of my colleagues from Iowa and from Texas. Look, our goal is to make the border much more secure, and we do. We do dramatically. As I said, just want to repeat this because I think it's worth repeating. 3 years ago, the effective rate, the effectiveness was 68%. That meant for every 2 people they either caught or turned back, 1 got over the border. It's now up to 82%. How did that change? It changed because we spent $600 million. We didn't tell them do this or do that. We said spend the $600 million to maximize your increase in operational control. Now we are giving the same people who have done a good job. In some sectors, it's above 90%. I believe in the Yuma sector in Arizona, it's above 90%. And that was one of the busiest. Is that right, Senator Flake? Did I have that right? And in El Paso, one of the Texas sectors, it's above 90. And so what we want to do is increase the effectiveness at the border. There is no question about it. And the bill goes a long way to doing it. And it does have triggers. The triggers are related to the exact same way that they've improved the border from 68 to 82. Those have to be implemented, whether it be more people, more drones, more fencing, to get to that 90% goal that we have. So there is no question about it. We want to do it. Now, the problem with the Grassley amendment is that it says certain things that are virtually, it changes the word substantially to fully operational. Does that mean if one radar is broken in one part of the border, that you can't begin legalizing the people who are here, and as Senator Flake said, the longer they stay in the shadows, the worse it is for the American workforce, the worse it is for the states they're in, the worse it is for all of America. That's what I believe this would say. 1 radar broken, or 3 out of 500, not fully operational, let them stay another 5 years in the present rotten status quo. And I'd make one other point, and this is in regard to my friend from Senator Cornyn, and I appreciate the good words you've said about our legislation. It may not meet your full, the full demands you have, but you talked about operational control. Operational control deals with having a person in each place. And what we have learned, and it was hit home to me when Senator Flake and Senator McCain took me to the Arizona portion of the border, it's vast. We have more people on the Border Patrol. What's the number? 21,000. I think it's triple what it was 5 years ago. But you can't have, if you want to have the whole federal budget, you guys figure out how you're going to get that money. The whole federal budget, just be Border Patrol, you could probably have 100% operational control. But what we found is different things work in different places. Intense personnel work in some places. Fences work in some places. Your state is a little different because it has a river as opposed to just land barrier, the Rio Grande. In many places, the thing that will be most effective to have the fewest people come over the border is air. Air patrol, even drones. And right now, as I understand it, Senator McCain knows this best. He knows the military stuff. There are only two of these drones on the whole southern border, and they can only work 8 hours a day because they don't have the personnel. And what I learned is very interesting to everybody. When these drones work, they don't just find the person who crosses the border, and they're good at finding everybody, night, day, sunny, cloudy, stormy. But they can follow them 25 or 50 miles in. So you don't have to just have someone standing at the border to try and catch them. You can catch them much later, and they sort of know the routes that these people go. So the idea of 100% operational effectiveness was abandoned because what we found is, first, it's impossible to have that many people and actually pay for it without breaking the bank. But second, and more importantly, in many areas, the effectiveness it's different in different places. And in some areas, especially those that don't have large numbers of crossing because of a river or because of ruggedness or whatever else, it's better to use stuff from the air with the personnel you need to apprehend. So this amendment would set a standard that would basically delay probably forever any legalization and bringing people out of the shadows. And at the same time, it demands too much one-size-fits-all. I think it would be less effective in actually making our border safer, more secure than what we do in this bill. And one other point I'd make. We also require, the border is not the whole thing in preventing illegal immigrants from coming here. 40% of the people who are here illegally come because they've overstayed their visas. They don't cross a border. They come in legally on a student visa, work visa, whatever visa, and they overstay, and we don't even check them. One of the triggers we have is that the exit-entry system must be implemented. And second, the reason people come, and we all know this, is for jobs. And they're so desperate, if I were making $1 a day in Oaxaca province and I could make $4 an hour in America, even though it's less than minimum wage, I'd be coming. I could spend $2 a week to my sick mother or something. Of course I'd try to come. But we have an E-Verify mandatory system that must be implemented as a trigger, something many on this side have demanded for many years. So our border stuff is really tough. But to simply say you have to have people all across the border, you have to treat each section of the border exactly the same, and it must be 100%. So if 3 radars are broken, you don't even begin the path that allows people to come out of the shadows, register, and meet their responsibilities.
We didn't change the 90.
I don't think it makes sense. So I would urge we oppose this.
May I ask Senator Schumer a question, Mr. Chairman?
Of course. And then Senator Grassley has asked for a
answers get short.
roll call, which once
I just
everybody's finished, we'll have.
I would have
Go
another
ahead.
comment, a question.
I just
comment.
wanted to ask Senator Schumer, he mentioned the figures 68 and 82%.
I got a list.
And I'm unclear what those refer to.
What?
You mentioned 68 to 82%.
It's a GAO report on the effectiveness rate of the border from year, it's now 2012 December, that's the report, but it measures it from before we implemented the $600 million till after. It's over the last 5 years.
Well, I would love to see that report because I just don't believe that's the case. GAO also found that only 45%, less than 45% of the border was under operational control. And I want to make clear that I'm not suggesting you need to have a body in every step of the way. And the Senator, I mean, we need a layered approach that you alluded to that uses technology, that uses tactical infrastructure, uses boots on the ground. But we need to get the job done. And the worst thing that could happen in this legislation is for it to pass and not to solve the problem, which I know you want to solve, but the bill doesn't do it. The problem is the effectiveness rate that you refer to does not take into account people who cross illegally and who the department is not tracking. In other words, it doesn't take into account the people that get away, which could, according to the anecdotal reports, could be, you know, 2 out of every 3, 3 out of every 4. The substantial implementation of the report does not tie anything into metrics. And as you said, I believe, Senator Schumer, you said 90% is a goal, but there's no trigger that implements this based on any metric. And that's why we're trying to get some metrics and some measures in place that will allow the goal that we're all saying we want to see achieved to be accomplished.
Just 2 quick points. I have the GAO report here, which I'll be delighted to send over to you. It distinguishes between operational control and effective rate. Okay,
and the effective rate doesn't take into account people who got away.
They abandoned operational control because they thought it was a useless measure.
Yeah, because it got bad grades, so they just decided to dispense with the grading system.
I think, Senator Cornyn, I don't know your experience in Texas, every expert I've talked to says it's gotten a lot better. Every single expert. Is it good enough? No. That's why we do things in this bill. But it's gotten a heck of a lot better.
I grant you that.
Okay.
It's gotten better, but 360,000 people are being detained each year coming across the border, which it could be 3 or 4 times that would get away. I just want to tell Senator Schumer, he might be interested in this. I was in, as I said, at the border on Sunday and Monday, and I know Senator Feinstein will probably find this interesting too. We're not just seeing the border penetrated by people from Mexico or Central America. Some of the rescue beacons are where people are actually rescued because one county had 129 people die last year just trying to come across. That's just the bodies they found. But the rescue beacons are in English, Spanish, and Chinese. And I said, why Chinese? They said, well, for $30,000, you can get one of the smugglers to get you up through Central America into Mexico and the United States. Another deputy sheriff in Brooks County showed me a picture of 3 gentlemen that they detained, all wearing, happened to be wearing some form of turban. And I said, well, where are these folks from? And they said, Afghanistan. And as we all know, the Border Patrol's documented that people from countries of special interest, including state sponsors of terrorism, have been detained coming across the southern border. So as everybody knows, and I know everybody knows this is a national security issue as well. It's a credibility issue. It's a national security issue. So we've got to get this right, and I hope we can work together to get it right. Right now is not sufficient.
I don't want to say that of all the things that have improved it. That is our metric.
Mr. Chairman, this is a huge, huge part of what this whole discussion is about. Senator Grassley is so correct that in 1987, the amnesty occurred, the legalization occurred, and the enforcement never occurred. We're about to do the same thing. If you pass this legislation, the amnesty is on track, the triggers don't work, and we will have that occur no matter what. Then what about the enforcement? This legislation on both counts, visas and border, weaken the existing metrics. The existing law requires an entry-exit visa at all ports. We passed that 2 or 3 times in the Visa Reform Act, and the 9/11 Commission insisted that we pass that law. This bill does not attempt to do the land borders. It does not complete an entry-exit visa system that GO said without the land borders in it, it won't work, and they're correct. Now, with regard to the border, the reason we've had some improvement at the border is because during the 2007 debate, when the bill failed, we did put in more money, and President Bush and perhaps even in President Obama's term, more Border Patrol agents were hired. And so there are more Border Patrol agents at the border. But as Senator Cornyn said, they're telling us that as many as 3 get by for every 1 caught. We caught 300 and something thousand last year. That means 1 million people are crossing the border. This is not fixed. And with regard to the idea that we built the fence, that is totally false. American people need to understand this is how you get taken to the cleaners. So I offered the legislation to build 700 miles of double fencing at the border, and they could choose where to put it. As it came, then I noticed the appropriations bill later that year had no money in it for fencing.
We should just vote it.
So Congress voted overwhelmingly to build a fence. When the appropriations bills came up a little bit later, there was no money in it. So we held up and had a big fight over the bill. And eventually money was put in for the fence. But it was never built. Only 36 miles of the legally required double fencing occurred. They had automobile barriers and other kind of barriers. We had a virtual fence. Do you remember that? We have computers, spent $1 billion on a virtual fence that was abandoned because it never worked. And we don't have the kind of fencing that the law requires even today. So what and I can recall vividly, right after President Obama took office, there was a raid at a workplace in Washington State, and they had identified quite a number of illegal workers there. He apologized for the action, did really an investigation of the people who were doing their job, and nullified the enforcement action and basically said we're not going to have those kind of enforcement actions anymore, and we haven't. The ICE officers have sued this administration saying you're blocking us from doing our work. You're denying us, you're telling us we can't comply with the law of the United States. So what I want to say to my colleagues, and I know you've worked hard on the legislation, but the American people have a right to be dubious. The American people have a right to demand confidence. I haven't talked, I don't think, much more than Senator Schumer has. And so I think that American people have a right to demand that we get it right this time. And we could do this. I think it's possible for us to do this. I would just note with pleasure that Senator Rubio yesterday said he would support an amendment and other things that would mandate specific portions of the southwest border be fenced with double-layer fencing, along with the funding to do it. So, I mean, I think we've got a bill that doesn't do that, and we need to do that. The bill does not require any fencing. So I appreciate the work of my colleagues, but we're going to read this bill. We're going to try to make sure that the promises are carried out this time, and we don't have this shell game of amnesty occurring, promises of enforcement that never occur.
I'm going to go to Senator Durbin and Senator Graham, just to go back and forth. Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was a big issue when the Gang of Eight came together. There were strong feelings, particularly on the Republican side. 2 of the senators were from border states, Senators McCain and Flake, and Senator Flake has already addressed this matter. They were determined that we do more, and we do. But let's not overlook what we have done in terms of border security. Some of the suggestions here about 3 out of 4 people getting away and the like, you just can't find the evidence to back that up. I note that my friends have said it's anecdotal, which means anybody can say it to anybody and be repeated here in this committee hearing. But let's look at the specific facts about this border. It is the safest it has been in 40 years. How can I say that? The President said it in the State of the Union address. Well, what's my basis for saying it before this committee? In fiscal year 2012, the U.S. government spent $18 billion on immigration enforcement. $18 billion. That is more than we spent on all other federal law enforcement combined. FBI, Secret Service, DEA, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. We spent more on immigration enforcement. The Department of Homeland Security has deployed unprecedented levels of technology and infrastructure at the border. The number of Border Patrol agents has more than doubled. 10,000 in 2004, 21,000 today. Better staffed than any time in the history of the Border Patrol. We've deployed thousands of miles of technology, including, as Senator Feinstein and others have noted, mobile surveillance systems, on and on and on, with significant results. Let's get to the results. In 2011, the latest year for which we have statistics available, 85,000 individuals evaded capture while crossing the southern border illegal. 85,000, compared to 600,000 5 years before. From 600,000 to 80,000. According to Pew Hispanic Center, for the first time in 40 years, net migration from Mexico has fallen to at or below zero. There are more Mexicans returning to Mexico than coming across the border into the United States. Having said all those things, and they're all positive, this bill says we're going to do more. We can't move forward until we have a comprehensive security plan. That means 6 months to put that together, and we start spending billions of dollars to implement it, adding to what I've just described. Now, I have to agree with my colleague, Senator Flake. We've sat together for 25 separate sessions going through every section of this bill. What he said gets to the point. Is America safer if 11 million people are living in the shadows, or is it safer if we follow through on this bill and they come out of the shadows, register, tell us who they are, where they live, where they work, pay their fine, and submit themselves to a criminal background check? Why, of course we're safer if they come forward. The Grassley Amendment delays that. And as it delays it, it doesn't make America as safe as it should be. And before, I would just say to Senator Sessions and others, before we can move from this RPI status to legal permanent resident, which is the path to citizenship, I will concede, significant other things must occur. I've heard Senator Sessions come to the floor repeatedly. I've seen him offer amendments on E-Verify. He believes in it. We do too, and it's included in this bill. What it means is from this point forward, applying for a job, we want certifiable proof of identity. No longer good enough that you have a Social Security number and pretend to be someone. Certifiable proof of identity through E-Verify. And going back to a point, I'll just finish by saying, going back to that point, 40% of undocumented people overstayed a visa. We are finally going to complete that system. It is a requirement before we can move to legal permanent resident.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Graham, it has to be.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next, Senator Graham.
Mr. Chairman, I think this is a very good debate. I understand the amendments offered in a very sincere fashion and has a lot of common sense components to it. I definitely get where people are coming from about border security. You should be skeptical. I mean, I understand the reason to be skeptical, but eventually we got to come up with a plan that will work and addresses the problem. And border security, our two Arizona senators seem to be pretty satisfied with this, but you can always make things better. But the question is this better in a fashion to get us to where we want to go? Here's what I would say. We have a Canadian border. I don't know how many fences we have along our Canadian border. If we have any, I don't know about it. I don't know how many security people we have along the Canadian border. I doubt it's 21,000. Why are we okay up there and not okay to the south? The tale of two borders. Why is one a problem and the other's not? because Canada is a place where people like to stay. They like Canada. We like Canada. We love to have them visit. They want to go home because it's a nice place. The people coming across the southern border live in hellholes. They don't like that. They want to come here. Our problem is we can't have everybody in the world who lives in a hellhole coming to America. We're just going to have to create order out of chaos. So you got to do something in the southern border you don't do in the northern border. But if you don't agree that the difference is jobs, then we just don't agree. There are 11 million people coming through the southern border because they come from countries where they can't find work and life is miserable. So it seems to me that if you can control who gets a job, you've gone a long way of controlling illegal immigration. Because as long as the jobs are available in America, you can't build a fence high enough to stop people. But if you could make it hard to find a job as well as hard to get across the border, I think you've gone a long way to fixing this problem, and I think we do. Now, here are the triggers. A comprehensive southern border strategy is submitted to Congress. A southern border fencing strategy is submitted to Congress. Right now, we have 352.1 miles of single fence. A vehicle fence, I guess that's people driving up down the road, 298 miles. Double layer fence, 36.2. The goal is to get to 700. Now, I agree with Senator Sessions. If you don't push this administration, they're not going to build one more fence. But they just don't have a desire to do that. I disagree with them. We're going to push them, and we're going to substantially complete the southern border fencing strategy. There are 13 drones available to us on the southern border. Only 2 fly because the FAA won't let more than 2 fly. This bill says you're going to put more drones on the border than 13, and they're going to fly all the time. The goal is to have 100% awareness of what's going on along the 2,200 miles. See the problem, then find ways to stop entry. And to my friend from Texas, you have convinced me that there are parts of the Texas-Mexican border you don't need a fence. Because when you come across it, is it Big Bend? You've got a 1,000-foot cliff to climb. If you can climb that cliff, we ought to consider giving you a visa. Putting a fence at the top of a 1,000-foot cliff probably doesn't make a lot of sense. And in Texas, you got a lot of private property problems you don't have in Arizona. So the goal is to see the 2,200 miles for the first time ever. And once you see it, you'll be able to find out how to interdict. But the ultimate goal is to make sure you can't find a job here as easily as you once could. You control the jobs, you're going to secure the border. So my belief is that substantially complete is the right way to go, fully operational. We're never going to get there because of what Senator Schumer said. And here's the crux of the problem. There's a lot of skepticism about securing the border on our side, but there's some skepticism on the other side that border security for us is not about keeping people out, but keeping the 11 million stuck.
Right.
Well, I don't want to keep the 11 million stuck, but I want them to be stuck as long as necessary to address the underlying problem, and they can't transition into LPR status from RPI status until mandatory E-Verify system is implemented, not substantially implemented, and an electronic exit system at air and seaports is being utilized. That, to me, is the key. Substantially complete the border strategy, get the drones flying, but before you transition, you got to have mandatory E-Verify up and running. That, to me, is the best trigger we could have come up with.
Mr. Chairman, I have a friendly question from my colleague.
Well, no, I was going to mention to Senator Graham that those kind words about the people who live in Canada, I'll send those to Marcel's relatives up there. I will translate them first into French.
Mr. Chairman, I had the honor to chair for a few years, co-chair the Mexican-American Interparliamentary. We traveled to Mexico. I think my colleague doesn't mean to suggest that while there's poverty in Mexico in some really poor areas, it's not a hellhole. It has some great things going on in Mexico. We're proud of the people of Mexico, and
You're going to call on me.
it does have some difficult areas, as I know you know. But I just want to say that
You're right.
the good people, a lot of progress has been made, and we're proud of Mexico, and we hope it continues to make progress.
Yeah, I wasn't slandering Mexico. I'm just talking about all the places people want to leave for whatever reason. Yeah, you're right. Good point.
Before we start sounding like we're writing travel logs here, I promised Senator Feinstein I'd hear from her, and if nobody else seeks recognition, that we'll have a roll call on this.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I just need 30 seconds.
How about
after Senator?
Senator Feinstein, Senator Cornyn, and Senator Grassley, and then we can call the roll. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to clarify the figures. Secretary Napolitano testified before us on April 23rd. Here's what she said. As of January 15th, 2013, DHS had installed 352